Howdy folks, hope you've all had a great weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. As always, Mingles with Jingles is advert free as a thank you to everybody who supports me on Patreon, and you can watch all of my videos 100% advert free because they're also available on Floatplane. Links to both Floatplane and Patreon down below in the video description, and thank you in advance to anybody who decides to take advantage of either of those two services. And of course, an extremely big thank you to everybody who has already taken advantage of those two services. I should probably take this opportunity right at the start of the video to warn you that I'm pretty much just going to be talking about the latest patch in World of Warships in this week's episode. So if you have no interest in World of Warships, or if you do have an interest in World of Warships but you have no interest in the patch notes, leave now and forever hold your peace. If you're still here at the end of the video bitching that I haven't spoken about anything but World of Warships, you've got nobody to blame but yourself. If this does describe you, I should thank you in advance, because if you have stuck around to the end of the video and then bitched about it in the comments, it's all good stuff as far as YouTube's viewer engagement algorithm is concerned, so thanks. So, this week, a very big patch hit World of Warships. I mean, the size of the patch wasn't that big, but the changes to the game's content, particularly for cruisers, were fairly massive. And also very confusing. One of the things that I always appreciated about World of Warships was how simple it was compared to World of Tanks. I mean, not that World of Tanks is a fantastically complicated game, but there are certain things in World of Tanks that it does kind of pay to know in order to be as good as you can be in World of Tanks. Things like, how much armour does the tank that you're aiming at have in the location where you're aiming? And there's a lot of tanks in World of Tanks, and that's a lot of information to remember. Not that you had to remember it. I mean, there's an armour penetration indicator. The colour of your crosshair changes colour depending on whether or not you have enough penetration to defeat whatever armour plate you're aiming at, but it never took into account angling. And also, you know, if you had a sufficiently high penetration gun, you could just assume that you were going to be able to penetrate most of the things that you were going to be shooting at. But if you could remember, for example, how much armour a Tiger has on the front, how much it has on the side, both on the hull and the turret, that sort of information would be very, very beneficial. This was never something that you ever really needed to know in World of Warships, because rather than every individual ship having different armour, there were armour thresholds that applied to broad classes and tiers of ships. So, for example, Tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships would generally have 32mm of armour plating. I mean, there were exceptions, but as a general rule of thumb, this was always the case. So if you had high explosive shells that could penetrate 32mm of armour, you were good. It was more or less the same for destroyers and cruisers. You didn't really need to memorise the specific armour values for every single destroyer and cruiser in the game, as long as you just remembered that Tier 8, 9 and 10 destroyers had 19mm of plating. If you had high explosive shells that could penetrate that, you were good to go. It didn't hurt if you could memorise the exceptions, like for example the Gearing has a 21mm armour belt, and the Khabarovsk in places has 50mm of armour. But as a general rule of thumb, just knowing these armour thresholds, Tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships, 32mm, Tier 8, 9 and 10 destroyers, 19mm, Tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers, usually 27 or sometimes 25mm. But if you had 27mm of high explosive penetration, you didn't need to know which cruisers had 25 and which had 27. Well, that all changed this week, and to be fair to Wargaming, it changed for a good reason, but I'm not entirely sure that it has been a good change. I guess time will tell. What are you talking about, Jingles? Well, they've changed the way the IFHE skill, the inertia fuse for high explosive shells skill, works, and they've also changed the armour plating of all cruisers. And the reason they did this, well, they did it for two reasons. The first reason was because the IFHE skill was just too good to not have if you were a light cruiser captain. Going back to the example of Tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships with their 32mm of armour plating, what that meant was if you were in a light cruiser on with 152mm guns, your high explosive shells basically couldn't damage them anywhere but in the superstructure, and the superstructure would very quickly become damage saturated. So unless you were setting fires, you basically weren't doing any damage to battleships. So why do you keep banging on about tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships, Jingles? It's not like they're the only battleships in the game. No, but almost half of the light cruisers in the game at some point are going to fight tier 8, 9 or 10 battleships because of the two-tier matchmaking spread. Tier 6, 7, 8, 9 and 10 cruisers all had this problem. Well, light cruisers. And the problem was solved by taking the IFHE skill. And that is bad game design. Because the whole point of being able to choose commander skills is that you should be able to choose commander skills. There shouldn't be one skill that you're going to be crippled if you don't have. And unfortunately, IFHE was that skill. So, the IFHE skill has been changed. Mostly it's just been nerfed. But we'll talk about that in slightly more detail later, because changing the IFHE skill isn't the only thing that they've done. They've also made significant changes to the armour plating of cruisers and battleships. Do you remember how it used to be relatively simple to know the armour thresholds of the targets that you were shooting at? Tier 8, 9 and 10 destroyers, 19mm. Tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers, 25mm. Tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships, 32mm. As long as you could remember that, and that's not a lot to remember, you were good. If you could also remember the exceptions, Gearing, 21mm, Khabarovsk, 50, Des Moines and Salem, 27, the 50mm strip around the bows of the Grosser Kurfürst, you know, things like this. Not essential to know, but very useful, and there weren't that many exceptions. The basic armour thresholds were fairly simple to remember, and the exceptions weren't that difficult to remember either. It wasn't like World of Tanks, where you might find yourself needing to know the armour thresholds of the turret and hull, front, side and rear of every tank that you could potentially find yourself shooting at. Yeah, well, that's all changed now, hasn't it? Here's what you now have to take into account when you're shooting at any cruiser between Tier 4 and Tier 10. And if at any point during the following explanation your brains start leaking out of your ears, I am sorry, but it's not my fault. It's Wargamings. Tier 4 cruisers, actually Tier 4 and Tier 5 cruisers that used to have 13mm of central deck plating now have 16mm of central deck plating, and whereas they would have bounced 186mm shells, they can now bounce 229mm shells, unless of course they're British light cruisers. Tier 6 and 7 cruisers that used to have 16mm deck plating now have 25mm of deck plating, whereas previously they would have bounced shells up to 229mm in calibre. They can now bounce up to 357mm or 14-inch gun shells. This, however, only applies to Tier 6 and 7 cruisers that have guns greater than 190mm in calibre. If they are light cruisers, where their deck was 19mm, it's now 25mm, except of course for British light cruisers, and except of course for British heavy cruisers London, Devonshire and Surrey, who did have 19mm of belt armour, and now have 25mm of belt armour, which means that when angled they were previously able to bounce 14-inch shells, and now they can bounce 15-inch shells. Then we move to Tier 8 and 9, and any cruisers that have greater than 190mm calibre guns, and the Megami, even if it's only using the 155mm gun option, have all had their midships deck armour buffed from 25 to 27mm, which will allow them to bounce 15-inch shells that ricochet off the deck. Tier 8 and 9 light cruisers with guns between 149 and 190mm, except for British light cruisers, have had any areas of deck that were 25mm buffed to 27mm, also allowing them to bounce 15-inch shells. And British heavy cruisers Cheshire, Albemarle and Drake have had their broadsides buffed from 25 to 27mm, giving them the same armour protection against 15-inch battleship shells. Finally, we get to Tier 10, and there isn't even one rule just for the Tier 10s. Instead, we've got individual rules per ship. For example, the Smolensk. Midships deck plating nerfed from 30 down to 16mm. The Colbert now has a broadside 21mm armour belt and 16mm, that's destroyer, levels of armour plating, 16mm of deck. The USS Salem and the USS Des Moines that used to have a 27mm armour belt now has a 30mm armour belt. And so on, and so on, and so on. So, Everybody got all that memorized? Yeah? Easy, right? What happened to 25mm of plating, tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers, with the exception of the Salem and the Des Moines? What happened to 32mm plating, tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships, with the exception of, well, the Kremlin, obviously, and the 50mm bow strip on the Grosser Kurfürst? So from now on, if you're in, well, anything, battleship, cruiser, destroyer, you've got the high explosive loaded and you're looking at a cruiser and you want to know whether or not your high explosive is actually going to be able to penetrate, good luck with that. Because it's not just the armour plating of all of the cruisers that have been changed. The IFHE skill has also been changed. Well, broadly nerfed. Well, it's kind of been nerfed and it's kind of been buffed. Previously, when you were looking at how much armour your high explosive shells could penetrate, when you moused over the gun of your ship, it would give you a number. Previously, that number was how much armour the shell wouldn't be able to penetrate. So if that number said 25, your high explosive shell would only be able to penetrate up to and including 24mm. Well, that's changed. Now, that number is the amount of armour that the shell will penetrate, which makes a lot more sense. It's far less confusing. So on the face of it, hooray, we have an extra 1mm of penetration on all of our high explosive shells. Well, you kind of do and you kind of don't. Because the way you calculate, you know, as if there wasn't already enough to remember, but the way you now calculate how much armour your high explosive shell can penetrate has also changed depending on what tier of ship you are. It used to be really, really simple. You took the calibre of the gun and you divided by 6, and that was how much armour your high explosive shells could penetrate. And then it got a little bit more complicated when the German battleships and cruisers were introduced, and they got a quarter calibre penetration rule, where you take the calibre of the gun and divide by 4. And then British battleships of a certain tier and up got the same rule. And then Japanese destroyers that had 100mm guns also got a special armour penetration calculation for their high explosive shells. But there weren't that many exceptions to remember. You had the quarter calibre rule for Japanese gunboat destroyers, certain British battleships and the Germans, and the 1/6 calibre rule for everybody else. Well, now you've also got the 1/5 calibre rule for light cruisers, cruisers armed with guns of 152 to 155mm at tier 8, 9 and 10. And then on top of all of that, they've changed the way the IFHE skill works. Previously, it gave you 30% additional armour penetration, but now it only gives you 25%. And instead of reducing your chance of setting a fire to compensate by, I think it was 3%, now it's cutting your chance of setting a fire by half. So, let's just quickly run down the list of everything that you have to remember now. Tier 4 and 5 cruisers have had armour plating changes, which are different to the tier 6 and 7 cruiser armour plating changes, with the exception of British light cruisers and certain of the British heavy cruisers, which are different to the tier 8 and 9 cruiser armour plating changes, with the exception of British light cruisers and British heavy cruisers, Cheshire, Albemarle and Drake. Oh, and of course the Megami is also an exception, which gets the heavy cruiser armour plating changes, regardless of whether it's actually using heavy cruiser guns or the 155mm guns, which are completely different from the tier 10 cruiser armour plating changes, which appear to be individually tailored on a ship-to-ship basis. And then, in addition to the 1/4 calibre high explosive penetration rule for the Germans, certain British battleships and Japanese gunboat destroyers, and the 1/6 gun calibre penetration rule for high explosive shells enjoyed by everybody else, you now also, if you have a tier 8, 9 or 10 cruiser, have to take into consideration the brand new, all singing, all dancing 1/5 calibre penetration rule, but only for light cruisers of tier 8, 9 and 10. And also, cherry on the cake, don't forget that the IFHE skill now only buffs your high explosive armour penetration by 25%, not 30%, and the chance of setting a fire if you've taken the IFHE skill has now been slashed by 50%. You've got all of that? What do you mean, no? What do you mean your brain started leaking out of your ears 5 minutes ago? How do you expect to remain competitive in World of Warships if you can't remember anything as simple as all of that? I don't know. Alright, tell you what I'm going to do for you simpletons. I'll put this into real world terms. We're going to stop the gameplay and show you some pictures. Okay, it's only the Division 2, nobody really cares. So here we go. Let's pick a light cruiser at random. How about the USS Helena, Tier 7 light cruiser? A fairly typical light cruiser armed with lots and lots of 152mm, or as we naval types like to refer to them, 6-inch guns. Without the IFHE skill, the Helena can penetrate 25mm of armour with its high explosive shells. Now that's quite significant, because one of the things that they wanted to do with all of these changes was to ensure that no cruiser would ever have to take an additional skill like IFHE in order to be able to reliably inflict damage on any other cruiser of the same tier. So we're looking at the Helena now, and this applies to all of the other cruisers in, well, almost all of the other cruisers in World of Warships, but more on that later. And if we look at the Helena's armour model, we'll see that she has 25mm of armour. Hooray, job done. Clearly there's no need for the USS Helena to take the IFHE skill anymore. Yeah, it's not quite that simple though, is it? That 25mm of penetration is all well and good if all you're shooting at is other Tier 7 cruisers, but what if you're shooting at Tier 7 battleships? Hello there, USS Colorado, with your 1mm more of deck plating than the Helena can actually penetrate without taking the IFHE skill. Well, that's a shame, isn't it? You'd almost think they'd designed it that way. But then again, this isn't an entirely realistic situation. I mean, how often can you expect the Helena to be top tier? Quite often she's going to have to be shooting at tier 8s or 9s. So let's throw a tier 8 into the mix, purely for demonstration purposes. In fact, let's not even make it a tier 8 battleship. Let's throw in a tier 8 cruiser. USS Baltimore, come on down. Oh look, you actually have thicker deck plating than the USS Colorado. Well, of course you do. So the Helena's going to need IFHE to do damage to you as well. Well, let's take a look at the Helena with the IFHE skill. There she is. Swap the captain out. And now the Helena can penetrate 31mm of armour. So she's good for shooting at same tier cruisers, for which she doesn't need the IFHE skill, same tier battleships, and higher tier cruisers, for which she does need the IFHE skill. But hang on, Jingles. You are making it sound an awful lot like light cruisers still pretty much have to take the IFHE skill. I mean, they can't damage higher tier cruisers or same tier battleships without it. Yeah, I can see how you might think that, but that's only because we've only looked at same tier and higher tier cruisers and same tier battleships. How about higher tier battleships? Is IFHE going to help against them? USS North Carolina, come on down. And the North Carolina, which by the way is nothing special, this is a typical tier 8 battleship, its thinnest deck plating is 1mm more than the Helena can penetrate, even with IFHE. How is this different to prior to the patch? Well, prior to the patch, the Helena could penetrate the deck plating of the North Carolina with the IFHE skill. So now the Helena requires IFHE to be able to damage same tier battleships, higher tier cruisers, and even with it can't reliably damage higher tier battleships. So if you have a light cruiser like the Helena, you don't need IFHE to damage destroyers and other cruisers of the same tier. You just need IFHE to damage almost everything else, with the exception of high tier battleships. Prior to this patch, light cruisers could hurt them with the IFHE skill, and now they can't. Well, you can still set them on fire, half as much as you could before, because IFHE now nerfs your fire chance by 50%. So they've done what they set out to do. They wanted to make IFHE not be a mandatory, you must spend 4 skill points here if you're in a light cruiser skill. And they've done that. They've done that by making the skill complete dog shit. They've made things worse for light cruisers, not better. If you're in a cruiser of any tier, the majority of the enemy team are not going to be other cruisers the same tier as you. And this was one of the primary drivers for this change, this perceived problem of cruisers that couldn't damage other cruisers of the same tier unless they took the IFHE skill. If you don't believe me, it's right there in the patch notes. and I quote, "High explosive shells fired by cruisers with 152 to 155mm guns should be capable of penetrating the plating of same type ships without the effect supplied by any extra conditions," unquote. And when they say any extra conditions, they mean the IFAG skill. And of course, everybody read these patch notes and they said, that sounds like a very noble aim. We applaud this wholeheartedly. But hang on a minute. Exactly which cruisers are struggling to damage other cruisers of the same tier? Unless we're talking tier 10 cruisers and they're shooting at the Stalingrad. Well, okay, there's the Atlanta and the Flint, but they're special cases because they only have 5-inch guns. They've got destroyer caliber guns. Cruisers aren't taking IFHE, so they can shoot up other cruisers. You've come up with a solution here for a problem that never existed. Cruisers were taking IFHE, so they could shoot up battleships. Ah, yes, Jingles, said all of the tier 8, 9 and 10 battleship captains. But they've fixed that problem, haven't they? They nerfed IFHE. Now those tier 7 cruisers can't actually damage us tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships. Yeah, you got me there. Prior to the patch they could, post-patch they can't, even if they do take IFHE. But before you all get too happy and excited, have they really fixed the problem? I mean, we're only talking tier 7 cruisers here. I mean, if you're in a tier 8, 9 or 10 battleship, you're going to be facing a lot more tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers than you're facing tier 7 cruisers. And tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers, do you not remember? I did mention this. I mean, I realise I mentioned a fuck ton of stuff. There's a lot to absorb in these patch notes. But tier 8, 9 and 10 light cruisers get a 1/5 caliber penetration rule for their high explosive shells. So if they take the IFHE skill, they can still penetrate your deck plating. Yeah, you're not laughing now, are you? No, I didn't think so. And in any case, what do you think the tier 7 cruisers are going to do? They're just not going to bother with the IFHE skill, and instead they're going to take Demolition Expert. Because we all know how much you battleships love to burn, right? So what exactly have they managed to fix with this patch? Because the problems they were trying to address were cruiser survivability and the fact that every light cruiser had to take IFHE. Well, they've managed to fix one problem that never existed, cruisers not being able to damage other cruisers of the same tier. They've managed to make IFHE a non-mandatory skill for cruisers of tier 7 and below, purely by virtue of making the skill completely shit. But it's business as usual for cruisers of tier 8, 9 and 10, because even with IFHE being a fairly dogshit skill now, they've given those cruisers, or the light cruisers of tier 8, 9 and 10, a 1/5 caliber high explosive armour calculation, which means that with the IFHE, all of those light cruisers can still damage same or higher tier battleships. The various different cruiser armour plating buffs, which were designed to help cruisers out against battleships, because every time you look over the patch notes, they're talking about the kind of armour-piercing shells that cruisers should now be able to ricochet off their belts and their decks. But what it doesn't mention in these patch notes, or doesn't advertise in these patch notes, is that these cruiser armour plating buffs are also nerfing lower tier cruisers, firing high explosives at them. I think the biggest losers of this patch are battleships in general, and tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships in particular. I say battleships in general because they're going to find that shots that would have punched clean through the belt or deck of cruisers prior to the patch are suddenly going to start bouncing. And I say tier 8, 9 and 10 battleships in particular because they're going to be suffering from all of these problems, and the IFHE nerf isn't really going to affect the cruisers that they're going to be fighting. The tier 8, 9 and 10 cruisers are still, with the aid of IFHE, going to be punching through their deck plating and farming all kinds of high explosive damage. And the tier 7 cruisers who can't do that to them, they're just going to say fuck it, not bother taking IFHE, invest in the cheaper Demolition Expert skill instead, and just set them on fire all day long. And we know how much battleships love burning, right? So, the TLDR version of the patch notes. RIP battleships, particularly tier 8, 9 and 10, who are going to find it harder than ever to inflict damage on cruisers while still eating just as much damage from them in return. Also, RIP cruisers tier 7 and below, who are now completely incapable, even with the now dogshit IFHE skill, of inflicting any kind of reliable and consistent high explosive damage on higher tier battleships, and who are probably just going to say fuck the IFHE skill altogether, take Demolition Expert, and just watch the world burn. Biggest winners of this patch? Heavy cruisers. Heavy cruisers for whom this patch is nothing but armour buffs against battleships and other cruisers, and who never needed IFHE in the first place. Finally, I want to end this week's very World of Warships centric episode of Mingles with Jingles, but you were warned at the beginning. If you're still here and you're complaining about the fact that it's nothing but World of Warships, you've got nobody to blame but yourselves. In a moment of supreme irony, can we just go back and remind ourselves one of the primary drivers for this change, according to Wargaming? It's right there in the patch notes, remember? They made a big song and dance about it. No cruiser should ever find itself in the situation of being unable to inflict direct damage to another cruiser of the same tier with its high explosive shells without being forced to resort to crutches like the IFHE skill. I'm paraphrasing, but that's basically what they said. Now, Wargaming did make a big song and dance about this, and I did say that this was a problem that didn't exist. Well, I have to be honest, that was a teeny little bit of an exaggeration, but only a teeny little bit of an exaggeration, because there were two ships in the game, Tier 7 cruisers both, that did suffer from the problem of not being able to damage other Tier 7 cruisers unless they took the IFHE skill. And they had this problem because while they are cruisers, they have destroyer armament. The Atlanta and the Flint both have 127mm gun batteries, lots and lots and lots of them, but they're still just destroyer caliber guns. Well, patch 0.9.2 arrived, and the Atlanta and the Flint still can't damage other Tier 7 cruisers unless they take the IFHE skill. Good job, Wargaming. And I think I was getting really emotional at your no cruiser left behind speech at the start of the patch notes. Anyway, that's it for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you're a World of Warships fan, or you probably haven't enjoyed it. And as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.